Okay, guys. Well, we're gonna have a bit of a chat for a short while. Um, and as you've noticed, this collection of topics for this year, they've all been published, and I thought they were good ideas when I looked at them, and then I started to realize that I'd set myself some interesting tasks. But although I'm interested in this stuff, and a lot of it I know bits about, when I start to put it together presentations or whatever, that's when you learn stuff. So, tonight we're exploring cults or the dark side of belief. And I just thought we'd have a dip in and have a sort of a round robin of some cults and cult behaviors. And more specifically, I'm interested in exploring what makes a cult rather than occult, and what makes a cult work from a psychological point of view. And I started to compile, well, about a month ago now, a list of cults I could talk about, and I ran out of things. If I'd have put them all on, we'd have been here till 3 o'clock in the morning at least, looking at the number of cults there were. So I've been selective deliberately, and there's like a little test as we go on. So let's move in with this, with a little definition. What is a cult? And I think if you say that to most people today, they will tell you that a cult is a group of people that stand outside of normal practice and normal beliefs, and there's something dodgy about them. And what's dodgy about them is sometimes indefinable or sometimes very definable. And one of the things I want us to think about and maybe talk later on when we get to the discussion bit is that is the word cult often a word that's used to dismiss or be prejudiced against individuals or groups, and who is saying what is a cult? That's fine, very interesting too. So we move forward, and the first thing to say is that the word cult is not always negative. You say it now, and these days, and people's sort of ears prick up, and they think there's something really terrible and horrible going on, and they usually think of sort of dark deeds. But really, the word cult, it just means a group of people who follow a particular religious or spiritual belief system, or, as we'll discover later, set of lifestyle practices or economic practices. But the Roman had a cult of cult of the emperor. The emperors were deified, and there was this cult of the emperors. We go a bit further back in time. We know that it's calling upon my recent visit to Egypt. There was the cult of Sobek in Egypt. Now, Sobek was the crocodile god, and quite an important god, and quite an important animal, because if you lived on the Nile, there was a good chance if you came across Sobek, you wouldn't be around very long. But interesting. And these deities, these images of supernatural beings, if you like, um, would have enriched not only the religion and the belief practices of an area, but in some cases been central to them, as would have been the cult of Isis. Um, ISIS worshippers, ISIS followers, uh, were around at the birth of the Egyptian religious system, and the cult developed as different stories got told about ISIS and Osiris and those particular myths developed, and it was spread around into Rome as well until Queen Cleopatra sort of managed to annoy the Roman emperor, and then Mark Antony got into the picture. It all got complicated, and but this cult of ISIS is there, and in fact, some would argue that the cult of ISIS is still around, in the sense that many pagans are associated or styled their belief system around what they believe the Egyptians were doing around ISIS. The Temple of Isis, which exists in Ireland actually, as a membership list that's quite wide and quite varied. And I know a lot of pagans who belong to in fact, I belong to the Temple of Isis, partly because I'm interested in in what was going on there. And of course, the lady that ran it had some very interesting ideas, which we'll talk about another time, perhaps. Um, the other cult that's from the ancient world really important is the cult of Mithras, and we often see this cult um, appears when we find lots of caves and temples underground in the Roman areas. Whereas temples were built above ground, Mithras temples were built below ground. And that was really interesting. And so far, there's about 200 underground temples that we know are linked to the cult of Mithras. And the god and the bull, the slaying of the sacred bull, was important. And maybe a topic for another time is to compare the Mithras cult with, I'm going to call this, with the Christ belief system, because there's some rather interesting parallels or apparent parallels between what the cult of Mithras were teaching about their deity and what Christianity teaches about its, I can't say deity, but its savior. So that's worth looking at sometimes. But another cult, if you've watched your Indiana Jones, you will know about the Thuggee cult. And the Thuggee cult were supposedly a group of probably Islamic or Muslim followers who worship the goddess Kali.
Found this on the web.
There we go. Thank you. That's my Siri telling me. Thank you. Thank you. And the Thuggee cult worshipped Kali and the death aspect of Kali. And one of the suggestions is they believed in keeping the world in balance by killing off people. That's why Kali's need for balancing the world. Another way of looking at it, they were a group of assassins or a group of thieves and robbers, and they did their dire deeds in order for their own self gain. What I think is really interesting, well, there's a couple of things interesting at Thuggee cult, is that they used to strangle or poison their victims because if you spilled blood at that particular time, that was actually a death sentence if they caught you. By strangling people or poisoning people, we didn't spill blood. And so therefore the offence was lesser, even if the person died. And of course, our word thug has owes its origins to the Thuggee. But something I was reading recently, and I don't want to sound too conspiratorial here, but there is the suggestion by some scholars today that the Thuggee cult, especially the kind of cult that was depicted in the Indiana Jones movie, or that was just a parody really, but the Thuggee cult was an invention of the British Empire because it needed to explain certain things away, and it did so by telling stories about the Thuggee cult. Now, there may well have been these followers of Kali, they may well have been robbers and assassins, but the extent to which they were important may have been amplified by Britain, that was, of course, the invading nation. Leave that for you to think about. The cult of Sibyl is another interesting cult. Sibyl was a Turkish goddess associated with fertility, but she was then adopted by Greece and Rome. And the 24th of March was known as the Day of Blood to the followers of Sibyl, who were then sort of some of her priests would castrate themselves and offer up their blood on her altars. They'd probably offer up other things as well. I think it's really interesting that she's the goddess of fertility, and yet they take away the ability to be fertile. There's got to be something in that. When you find images of Sibyl, you often find her not as in this one here. She's looking quite calm and reflective and probably looking quite shocked at what the priests are doing. I don't know. But when you find some pictures of the celebrations of this cult, they're very orgiastic, and their priests were known to take part in erotic rites. Well, while they still could and while they still had their bits intact. But these are ancient cults that have existed, and we talk about now historically, with interest, and with connection to, well, some of us looking back now on our pagan origins, look back at these cults and these sort of festivals, and we, in some way, have sanitized them and brought them in up to date, and we call them various things in our pagan practice. The other cult I love was the Pythagorean cult. Yes, that's Pythagoras, the mathematician. He could act, well, at the time they were described as a cult because they gathered around one or two um, uh, leaders, Pythagoras being one of them, and they kind of lived together in a commune. And the commune was divided into those that engaged in the higher secrets of mathematics and those that were probably numerically illiterate and sat around the edges. And these two classes of people were all part of this cult. Of course, Pythagoras, as we know, tried to explain the world in terms of maths and numbers. And there's a lot, apart from the Pythagoras rule of the triangles, there's a lot of magical stuff that comes from the Pythagorean peoples. So anything to do with the number seven, you know, seven notes in an octave, seven colors in the rainbow. I won't go anymore, but those are sacred ideas to Pythagoras. And so when you were sitting in school, learning the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, and thinking, what the hell is that about? What we could have been told about was why red was associated with certain things and why the number. Oh well, I could go on, but I won't. One of the things I loved about Pythagoreans that we know, because again, all this is about what we know, and what we know is just the tip of the iceberg to what was really going on with these people. But we do know that Pythagoreans revered beans. They're also vegetarian, but they revered beans because they thought the beans contained, in some cases, the souls of the dead, and so they would avoid eating or harming beans. Um, and if you think about it, there's a certain kind of interesting magical symbolism there. You know, a bean when you can watch it sprout and grow. I remember doing that in school. You get broad beans, sticking in some wet tissue paper, and a couple of days later, we'd see the shoots coming and go, "Oh, that's great." But maybe, you know, we're downplaying that significance now. To these people, life comes from a seed. Makes perfect sense. Oh, oh, I've cut. Hang on, I'll get back onto it. Hold on, I don't know what I did there. Uh, 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 there you are. Sorry about that. I closed it down. Um, then, of course, we got the Eleusinian mysteries or the Eleusinian mysteries, which were the wonderful mysteries about journeys into the afterlife, based on the Persephone and Demeter myths, which I'm sure that you're aware. Demeter's daughter Persephone lost herself in the underworld, and Demeter refused to make crops and plants grow until the underworld gave her back. And the deal was that she would come back for 6 months of the year and go back for the other 6 months of the year. Great, great stories and myths. Um, but these mysteries of going to another world that was fertile and ripe, and that if you knew the right words, you could bypass the torments of aspects of the afterlife, were really interesting. And if you've seen the film Gladiator, there's some wonderful sequences in there which capture the idea of what they may have thought the Elysian fields were. Um, they were these fields of ripeness and grain. And there's a wonderful sequence of towards the end of the movie where the gladiator, Russell Crowe, is walking through these fields of grain, and his family, who have been murdered years ago, come to meet him across the fields of grain. All the while, there's this wonderful ethereal voice singing the songs. Great image and a lovely idea. So, that's the medieval world and the idea, so in the ancient world, their idea of cults. But cults have always existed. And I thought we could take a bit of a whistle-stop tour, not an exhaustive tour, around a few of the modern cults or more recent cults and decide what the characteristics are that make a cult a cult. And again, I'm being careful I say this because sometimes when I say cult, it might mean it sounds like I'm saying occult. And it's quite interesting the linking of those two words, which we can talk about later, perhaps. So, if we look at the list of cults that there are, we can see that they fall into these categories. There are religious and spiritual cults. There's political cults. There's self-help cults. There are sex cults. There are doomsday cults, and there are cults to do with extraterrestrials. And we'll look at what defines a cult in a moment. We're going to do a whistle-stop tour through half a dozen or so of these cults for us to try and explore some key ideas, and also to remind you of some of the infamous characters involved in these cult activities. So, no pride. Well, I'll tell you what, do for yourself. You have a guess who that is. I'm going to show you the picture of the cult leader first and then talk about it. But most of you will pick him up as not George Harrison, as David Koresh. And David Koresh was very interesting recent cult leader. And now I'm only going to whistle stop tour of the background because some of the background and the stories behind these people are really interesting in the sense of you can see how their psychology has developed. But say David Koresh was born Vernon Howell, and he took control of something called the Branch Davidians. Now, the Branch Davidians were basically an offshoot group from the Seventh-day Adventists. They really came into being in the 1950s, where the founder, a guy called Benjamin Roden, developed a commune in Waco at Mount Carmel, which is where Koresh ended up. And Vernon Howell, as he was known, was a very interesting gentleman. Vernon Howell obviously had a problematic childhood, or so we think he did, but ended up being drawn to the Seventh-day Adventists. And it was discovered that he had a gift, if you like, for oratory, for talking. And he was obsessed with reading the Bible, in particular, the book of Revelation, which is, if you know anything to do with the Bible, the book of Revelation is a pretty obscure text, and it's full of images about the end of days, variously depicted in horror movies and stuff. But if you read it, it's quite interesting, and that's another story, perhaps. So Vernon Howell became David Koresh because he claimed to be the chosen one. And at some point, there was an internal power struggle between the leaders of the Branch Davidians, which he actually won. There was actually a gunfight at Mount Carmel between the two opposing factions of the Branch Davidians, after which David Koresh became the leader and set up his commune. He believed he was the Lamb set to pave his way for the second coming. And he saw all of his followers as students of the seven seals. Again, a beautiful allegory in the book of Revelations about opening of the seven seals, and when the Lamb opened the first seal, the second seal, and so on. So the Lamb is the character that brings about the end of days so that the Christ can come. Incidentally, if you're into your rock music, a band called Aphrodite's Child did an album about the Lamb opening the seven seals way back in the 60s. And Aphrodite's Child had a very young Vangelis playing on keyboards and a very young Demi Roussos singing. Just a bit of sidelines there. We all probably know the story of the Branch Davidians that sort of in '93, the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms branch of the federal investigations, wanted to serve warrants on Mount Carmel because there were reports of David Koresh's people buying and selling guns, vast quantities, and there were also reports of child abuse because the family lived as a big commune. And yeah, and there was a firefight then where 4 ATF agents were killed, 16 wounded, and six of David Koresh's followers were killed. That led to a major standoff that lasted 51 days and ended by a fire that burnt down the Waco buildings, killing 76 out of the 85 Koresh group, and many of them were children. There are still arguments about what started the fire, and the FBI, I know, treat these as a case study to learn from, because the authorities made lots of mistakes in how they dealt with this. In fact, it is suggested that two of the agents were on the verge of talking Koresh out, provided he could actually have a vehicle for spreading his word, that is, publishing his works. And he was on the way out, and then the military decided to step in with tear gas and all that kind of stuff. And the whole thing was disaster. It was a horrible situation. You may remember seeing it on television. I certainly do. And yeah, aspects of the Branch Davidians still exist, going back to their Seventh-day Adventist roots. But say David Koresh was killed. Interesting character. You may not know these two. Well, there's two of them. There's the younger version of him on the right there, and the older version of him on the left there. Again, if you've got any ideas, just jot them down. Answer will be given in a moment. These two are fascinating, and you will have heard of them, but you may not connect. These two are the characters of the Heaven's Gates cult, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. They basically had a cult that was an extraterrestrial UFO cult, saying that there were UFOs coming to take us to the next stage of our evolution. They changed their names to Doe and T. Some writers suggest they changed them to Bo and Peep. I've even heard some writers calling them Pinky and Perky. But these people changed their names because they were inspired by the aliens to do so. And, group members were instructed to resource, renounce friends, family, media, drugs, alcohol, jewelry, facial hair, and sexuality. And they were also to give all their money to the group. Now, the Heaven's Gate ideas, or Applewhite and Nettles, were running from the 1970s and developing lots of little pockets of groups, many of which fell away. But it was that time when people were getting more and more open to finding things on the internet. There was an upsurge in interest in UFOs, and Applewhite and Nettles seemed to have a suggestion about what was going on. Nettles died in '85, and Applewhite continued to say that she'd ascended to the next level, and she still communicated with him. They lost a lot of supporters because they suddenly decided that he must be nuts. However, those that remained get more and more brought into the story he was telling. He started to claim that he was a walk-in, that he had died and a new refreshed soul had been replaced the original one. Now, I've got to be careful of some of the things I say here, but there is another group that have this idea of souls replacing souls. The Scientologists have an interesting set of ideas, but I'm not going to talk deeply about them because they are very litigious and they have lots of money behind them. And I've fallen foul of them once before, but that's another story. So it is really interesting. Then in 1997, the Al Hale Bopp comet was coming back, and Marshall Applewhite sort of said, look, in the Tails comet, the mothership is coming to take us back. And when the comet passes, the mothership will beam us all up, take us all up, and allow us to ascend to a new level. 38 members, 39 members of the group, in groups of 15, 15, and 9, made videos telling their whatever family were around and saying that they were going to go to the mothership. They put on flight suits. They wore flight suits with badges that said Heaven's Gate, and the other badge said the away team, obviously influenced by Star Trek here. And then they killed themselves because they believed that the mothership would take them to a better place. And Applewhite was amongst that group. When people found the bodies, they were lying in their bunk beds with these away team costumes on. It is suggested that they must have really believed in the stories that Applewhite was telling, and they went with him. Interesting and sad. Here's somebody you may not recognize. I think this is a really interesting guy. He looks like a dodgy businessman. I wouldn't buy a second-hand car from him. Neither would I buy a self-help package from him. Now, I've got to be very careful here because some of the group exist and they can be litigious. But he is the founder of the Lighthouse Group. He's businessman Paul Well, and he started the Lighthouse Group as a life coaching group. He offered executive coaching and a promise to take your life and business to the next level, whatever that was. To join this group, to join the coaching, it cost you £10,000 a year. And then you could become a Lighthouse Associate Director for £25,000 a year. And many people were taken in by this, especially the post-yuppies, the post groups of people that had been affluent and then weren't affluent anymore and wanted some help out of their problems. But what it really was a kind of pyramid selling. People were brought in at the £10,000 a year to be given coaching. Then they were sold the next level, take them higher up the chain. Eventually, they were paying thousands and thousands of pounds to an organisation which said it was making them feel better and become better versions of themselves, but in effect was making them dependent. And of course, if they hadn't reached the next level of development, their coaches would say they were lazy and make them work harder. When you became an associate, you started having daily morning calls from 5 a.m. And initially that was just to catch up to see how you're doing. But then within 6 months, the calls became 5 or 6 hours long with up to 30 people online. And these calls from the people who were in these calls said that they were very coercive. They were very about selling up the products, about coming on board and not being able to progress unless you bought more and more. They were told different things about what the money they paid was for, but they were all told that their investment brought them a pioneering lighthouse mentoring, which would transform their lives. It didn't in many cases. And the question is is it a cult? Was it a cult? By the way, this was in Britain. Was it a cult? Yeah. The company closed down in 2023, but it seems that Lighthouse Global still has legs, not operating in the UK. And there were court trials for all of these people, which they were not prosecuted for anything, but they were told to close down Lighthouse. I think it's an interesting example because you might say, well, it's nothing like the others where they were losing livelihoods. Losing life, but they are losing livelihoods, and they were suckered into a scheme which actually showed little promise of delivering what it actually set out to do. And the challenge since or during the exploration of these lighter scripts is that the phrase coaching, in this country, coaching is not regulated. So if you are going to a therapist, a lot of therapists are regulated. They are licensed in some way in the UK, but coaching is unlicensed. So anybody can call themselves a coach. Doesn't matter. But for me, what matters is the intention behind the coaching. And I think this intention was financial for the coaching company rather than for the individuals, and was not empowering. My standard line when I take on a client, or a coaching client, is that it's my job to make myself redundant to you as quickly as possible. This group obviously didn't, and obviously I'm doing the wrong thing. Now, here's a character you may or may not recognize, depending how far back you go with your interest in this stuff. I find this character fascinating. It is the Reverend Jim Jones. He founded what's called the People Temple, or the People's Temple, or the People's Temple of the Disciples of Christ. And he founded it in 1955, or way, way back. And he was working, initially, he was working in white and black areas, and he was doing, let's call it, balanced work. He was friends with Martin Luther King, he knew Malcolm X. He was actually doing what I would call really fair, multiracial, multi-faith work. However, something was going on with him psychologically, and his rhetoric and his ability to tell a good story meant that more and more people followed him. And I think that's the danger, that he started to believe his own press. The US media began to report unfavorably about the group. And so what he did was he said, right, we're all going. And they went to Guyana, and they created a settlement called Jonestown, not surprisingly. And by about 1978, there were 900 people living in Jonestown in this commune, all listening to the word of Jim Jones. And this is where it starts, I think it really starts to twist. People worried about their families, their children particularly, going over and joining Jim Jones in Jonestown. So they asked initially the FBI to look into it, and Senator Leo Ryan said he would look into it, and he flew down to Jonestown with some helpers to investigate what was going on and to make sure that all of the children that, or the young people, not children, young people, young adults who were in the commune were there, not under duress. And it was a very, by all accounts, positive meeting. The senator was kind of pleased, and the people that he spoke to said, yeah, we're not being forced to stay here. We want to stay here, send messages back to our parents, we're okay. But on the way back to their flight out of Guyana to the airstrip, Jones started to get a little bit paranoid about what was being reported. So he sent some of his henchmen, is the best word I can think of, and they assassinated Leroy and 3 journalists that were there, and the cult defector who was with them. They were all killed. From that moment, the People's Temple was doomed, because Jim Jones's own paranoia took over. He didn't know who to trust. He started to call meetings at stupid hours and doing continual sermons or whatever. And basically, he convinced his followers to drink cyanide-laced lemonade. It's where that phrase from, beware what's in the lemonade, or that. More than 900 people died in Jonestown, men, women, and children. There were reports of the parents giving the children the cyanide first, and then them taking it themselves. And it was all because Jim Jones managed to convince those people that they were going to be killed anyway, because they they were the only people who held the truth, and the outside world was coming in to destroy them. Very sad. Now, this guy I know won't need any introduction. The guy on the right is obviously Charlie Manson, and those three ladies there are his disciples of death. Charlie Manson, really kind of well-known example of a cult leader. Established himself as a guru in Haight Ashbury in the early hippie days, 1965, 60s. He'd had a pretty interesting background, including several stays in prison. Then he took on the Bible, and then and if you look at and what is interesting is to look at the early life of some of these people, because that's how their early ideas were seeded into what they did. But he started to preach. He tried to play the guitar a little bit. In fact, he made some demo discs, so much so that one of the Beach Boys, Brian, got his son in, but Brian, one of the Beach Boys, actually allowed Charles Manson to stay at his house. So they were mixing with this kind of musician hippie circle. But the girls that followed Charles Manson, the Manson family, and Charles Manson himself couldn't maintain any kind of relationship that wasn't a using relationship. So the Beach Boy guy threw them out, basically, and they went to establish their home at a place called Spahn Ranch in Los Angeles. Spahn Ranch was an old movie set. It had been a ranch, but it was now a movie set where they used to shoot westerns, and that had stopped. They stopped filming the westerns, so he lived there. And of course, Manson taught that the fact that the end of the world was near. That was his teaching, and his basic idea was the black races would rise up and kill the entire white population, with the exception of himself and his followers. And he took a song title from the Beatles and called this period of upheaval Helter Skelter. It seems that Charles Manson also wasn't averse to trying to stir up some racial hatred himself, because the first person he killed was actually linked to the Black Panthers, and he left messages around to say it was white people that did it. And when on that terrible day they went in to kill the Tate, Sharon Tate, and the people who were there, they left messages around to suggest it were black people that did it. And the Tate murders became big news. Sharon Tate, which was Roman Polanski's wife, Tate's friends, one of her friends was pregnant, so her unborn child. They were all massacred by the women of the family. It seems that in the Tate murders, Charles Manson was on the periphery, but certainly he was the person that was instigating it all. And so he was locked up. Here's a wholesome looking boy, a blue-eyed guy, youngish guy, looks kind of, you might buy a used car from this guy. You wouldn't from the other guy, but you might from this guy because he's got, nice teeth and a cropped beard. He was a co-founder of a group called NXIVM, Nixism, I don't know how he pronounced it. And again, this was an executive coaching program he set up. It was personal development. Initially started out as ESP, Executive Success Programs, and a few years later was rebranded under NXIVM. He, at this period, adopted the title Vanguard from his favorite arcade game, in which the destruction of one's enemies increases one's power. And there we go. This is the cutthroat game of high finance and business. And again, whether it started out to be this, I don't know. But Raniere himself, in his conclave of supporters, created a subgroup called DOS. I'm not going to try and spell the Latin, but you can read it yourself. And these were levels of women that were slaves headed by masters. And slaves were expected to recruit slaves of their own. and all the slaves were branded. If you look this up, you can find the brand that they were fire branding. I'm talking about, like you brand cattle. Um, Horrible, horrible. All of this was running underneath the surface of what they were calling their coaching um, program. And so people on the coaching program would gradually be drawn into this web deeper and deeper, and maybe became parts of it. And in 2019, Rainey and Sultan were both accused of running an abusive sex cult to this company, and both were found guilty on a variety of crimes. Um, and again, part of me wonders, what's the psychology of this person? Did they set, these two people, did they set themselves up to become this terrible group? Or did they develop a group and they got power hungry and their psychology was such that we've got this much power, we can start to take advantage of other people? Not good. Here we go. It looks a bit like Faye Dunaway, doesn't it? This is an interesting lady. You probably have never heard of her, but I will enlighten you right now. Her name is Annie Hamilton Byrne, and she believed that she was a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. And under that guise, she gathered some small followers on a remote estate and started a sadistic cult, which ran through the 1970s, 1980s. Basically, there were children in the group, and she would start beating the children for not showing devotion to her. She even prepared these children for a coming apocalypse by bleaching their hair and giving them identical haircuts. Bit scary, eh? She adopted many of these children, often illegally, and it's thought through kidnapping. So in total, she kept 28 children on her property and prepared them for the apocalypse. According to people that were part of this cult, she was on LSD most of the time, and she forcibly injected LSD into the kids. She was caught after some children escaped and alerted the authorities, who then rescued the other children. This woman was taking the most defenseless parts of our society, who wouldn't know where they were and what they were doing, and abusing them sadistically. Scary stuff. You may know this guy, you may not. It's not Demi Roussos, you're okay. He's from a different ethnic background. This is Shinko, or Shinkayo. That was the name of the group. It was a Japanese doomsday cult founded by Shoko Ashara, which is the picture you saw in 1984. The cult was aiming to recruit young university graduates and taught them that the apocalypse was near and that they would be the only ones to survive. The group came to prominence when members of the group committed the sarin gas attack on Tokyo subways in 1995. It was said that this could have been an attempt to bring about the apocalypse, but 13 people died in that attack and thousands were injured because of the sarin gas release. And then 13 members of the group received death sentences. Now, this is interesting. The cult was never banned in Japan, and it moved there. And of offshoots with a group called Aleph and Akira Nowa, which have estimated 1,500 followers today. So this is a doomsday focused cult who are obviously a bit like Applewhite and Nettles, wanting to prepare their followers for the end of times, the end of the world, but maybe also engage in bringing it about. Scary stuff. Another character you may or may not know, interesting character. Yeah, I hope you're marking your own homework, by the way. This is Daniel Perez. He had a group called Angels Landing. He was a seer, claimed to be 1,000-year-old angel, and he led a traveling group of mostly women from US state to state. It was the Angels Landing caravan. He told his followers he needed to have sex with young girls to stay alive. Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? Over the years, Perez collected millions of dollars in life insurance policies from members of the cult who died. So, in his 2015 trial, Perez was convicted of 28 crimes, including first-degree murder, rape, aggravated assault, sexual exploitation of children, amongst other things. And he was sentenced to life in prison. I think he's still there. But again, these people joined this guy, and this guy's rhetoric, his story, his patter was enough to convince them he's telling the truth. And I don't know, if somebody came up to me and said, I'm a 1,000-year-old angel, I think I would, my kind of filters would click in a little bit about, hang on a minute, but obviously for some people it doesn't. We're nearly at the end of this list, this rogues gallery. I'm wondering how you're doing on knowing who these people are. This group, these two, are interesting. Well, they're all interesting. I've got to be careful here. When I say this group are interesting, I'm not celebrating the suffering they've caused. From a psychological profiling sense, I'm interested. What causes people to behave the way they do and do the things they do? But these two are the Order of the Solar Temple. They're Joseph Di Mambo and Luc Ret. They really managed to synthesize a lot of New Age spiritualism and drew followers from Switzerland, France, and Canada in 1984. They were sometimes called the Order of the Solar Knights, as in Solar Knights with a K, and they alluded to all kinds of connections to ancient groups. But the Order of the Solar Temple started to get very doomsday focused. The more followers it got, the more doomsday focused they became and the more money they earned. And in 1994, a man who spoke out against the cult was killed in his home along with his wife and baby. These people were not nice people. Days later, 2 temple buildings in Switzerland went up in flames, and investigators found 48 bodies inside. Some were shot, some were found with bags over their heads, and some had been injected with tranquilizers. And then 5 more members died in Quebec in 1997. Yeah. This is a little bit like the Koresh thing, perhaps because it's fire. I think it's more like the Jonestown thing, that once they'd overstepped the mark from which they get away with things, something drastic had to happen to the members of the organization. And it did. So, okay, now I've depressed you enough with these cults and these villains. Let's offer some thoughts about cult and cult behaviors. You've had a snapshot there, a very small snapshot of some of the most well-known cults and what they were doing. But let's have a look again. So we said there are different kinds of cults. I think that, we could put certain of the cults we talked about into these categories. I think Branch Davidians and People's Temple were religious spiritual cults. I think Ham Shinriko were political in some way. The self-help cults were Lighthouse and NXIVM. Sex cults, probably Anne Hammerson Brightburn and Angel's Landing. Doomsday cults, Branch Davidians, the Family, Shinriko, and the Solar Temple. And extraterrestrial cults, well, Evans Gate is an example. So what I tried to do was find an example of each one of these kinds of cults that we know exist. There are more. And if you're really fascinated, and want to depress yourself to the depravity of human behavior, go and look some of them up and look up some more as well. Now, there is something called the Cult Information Center, which is a socio-political organization that wants to inform people about cults. And this is what they say makes a cult. A cult is a group of people that use psychological coercion to recruit and indoctrinate potential members. Now, though that indoctrination can be akin to brainwashing, but long, boring lectures that you've got to sit and listen to for hours and hours and hours and hours could be considered to be that coercive and indoctrination. Uh, that's why I don't go on for more than an hour. Don't be accused. Um, it also is a cult is an elitist or totalitarian society. That's a group of people that somehow justify their existence of being apart from society because they have an important message or they have a truth that nobody else has, and therefore they have to be ruled and governed so there's no intermixing of their and loss of their secrets and their identity. Generally, in a cult, the leader is self-appointed. Nobody puts them there. They're dogmatic. They're messianic in the sense that they are the bearer of the message we all need to hear. They're unaccountable. And what makes all these people work is often, at least initially, they are charismatic. There is something about them that draws people to them who listen long enough to be hooked. And once they're hooked, everything else comes in. Um, Often a cult believes that the ends justifies the means, and the idea is to solicit funds and recruit people. The more people you have, the more people you control, and you control their behavior, their finances, and their connections with other people, then the more power you are gaining by taking away power from the individuals. Uh, its wealth, whatever it is, does not benefit the members of the group or the society. And here's the other thing: most cults do not actively, sorry, most cults don't open themselves to people who are casual. They are recruited actively. So that cult I cannot mention for the sake of uh, reprisals. They offer um, a series of psychological tests, various outreach centres across big cities. I know because I went into one afternoon when I was a student, knowing exactly what it was, and I was going there with interest to find out what happened. And you do this questionnaire, which is cleverly constructed psychological questionnaire. The questionnaire goes back to be marked, and you're given a book by a gentleman called L. Ron Hubbard to read while you're waiting. And then somebody comes out and says, "Oh, we've looked at your profile. There are gaps in your abilities and your emotions are blocked in this way. Come to the office, sit down, and we will talk to you privately." And of course, the psychological profile they've taken is part of their recruitment method. And once you get in the doors, you are then convinced that there's something wrong with you and that only they can put it right. And it goes from there to there to there. So I think, warning signs, if you ever came across a group of people, look for some of these signs, you know, and ask yourself, is this person um, trying to give me something which I'm going to pay for dearly further down the line? I think from my point of view, these are the ones that I think are the flags, the red flags. If they're offering secret teachings or exclusivity, I'm going to tell you the secret only to you or this small group of people, but you've got to come along with me now. And if you come along with me now and sit in this room, I'll talk to you for an hour. And at the end of that hour, if you don't want to stay, then you can go. But at the end of that hour, if you stay, you're in. Ooh, that's the way that bit works. Because nobody likes to be rejected from a group. I'll share this tip with you. Um, I used to, for a number of years, do a stage act that involves stage hypnosis. One of the stage hypnosis acts that you've seen. And one of the reasons I stopped doing it was it just didn't sit comfortably with me. But one of the techniques that stage hypnotists will use is they get as many people they can on stage after doing some stuff in the audience, about linking your fingers and raising your hands. They get as many people from the audience on stage. And that's when the hypnosis starts, but that's when the selection starts. Because bit by bit, certain people are thanked and returned to their seats. And the implication there is if you've not been returned to your seat, you're special and you're good enough to be for the hypnotist. It goes on that way until they're left with a dozen or so selected volunteers who, it has been implied, they're the best for this set of experiments because they are intelligent, smart, and creative. Pretty manipulative, eh? Um, so there's a charismatic authoritarian leadership that then leads to not wanting to disappoint your leader, and so you keep on working to make them feel good or not be disappointed in you, which then leads to behavior that's controlling and repressive. There is, in most cults, a complete loss of financial and social independence. You're told where to go, when to get up, when to go to bed, what to listen to, what to eat in many cases, and all of your financial independence is taken away because often you end up signing a lot of money, if not your bank account, over to the cult group. In a weird way, although cults operate through communes, it's about isolation. They want to get you isolated from the people that could cast doubt on what you're being taught. So if you're being taught that there's a spaceship in the comment of Hal Bob and you are going to be part of the away team, what the cult leader doesn't want you to do is go outside the circle and talk to somebody else who's got a different story to tell, because that creates doubt and so you're isolated. And then there are often reprisals when a member leaves. There are several active cults that if you leave the group, you are not only intimidated, but your life is made hell, because there are teams of people that will go around and knock on your doors at all hours, follow you around, and just become very oppressive by their presence. They're not doing anything that's breaking the law per se, they're just making your life uncomfortable. And one of the aforementioned groups that I shan't mention for legal purposes is pretty good at that. So how many cults are there today? You'd think there would be that many, but in the UK alone, there's between 500 and 800 active cults within the UK. In the USA, it's between 2,500 and 8,000 active cults. Now, the problem with that is that we don't know how many are active because they're secretive. If we know about them, there's a very good chance that they're on the verge of either being watched or we know about them and there is something going to happen in the near future to expose that cult. But we don't know about a lot of these. We really don't know about a lot of these. And for those of us interested in alternative religions or new religious movements, as the FBI call them, we are probably aware of people that maybe say they practice the same thing that we practice, and they're actually not practicing what we practice. They're using what they've learned, they're using their knowledge, they're using their magic to entice other people into a group for various nefarious purposes. Without mentioning names, I think I can because it's public knowledge, but I won't. There were two gentlemen in Falmouth a few years ago that claimed to be Wiccans or into magic, and these gentlemen were actually enticing young girls to their altars, and it wasn't to do magic. Thankfully, they were stopped. But there are groups, and I know that maybe some of you come across those groups. You would, by the definition we talked about, actually call cult. And yet they're getting away with a lot of stuff because technically they haven't gone too far yet. And that begs the question, what turns a human being from a leader of a spiritual group, shall we say, into the leader of a cult, into a diabolical maniac that rapes, kills, and tortures? something is clicking in that person. In some of the ones I've looked at, my feeling is they started off being very unbalanced, with an unbalanced background, found something they were good at, found they could have followers. When they had followers, that gave them power. When that gave them power, or a feeling of power, it meant that they were unaccountable. And once they were unaccountable, that kind of meant they could do whatever they want, whatever their crazed little mind took them to be. But we need to think carefully about what makes a cult a cult. Just having an alternative viewpoint doesn't make it a cult. We know in the pagan movement how certain Christian minded, limited folk have said that what we're doing is not only occult, which is dangerous, but it's occult, which is dangerous too. And they're choosing to label because they either don't understand or they're scared. And I think that's an interesting idea. So your viewpoint can define a cult or not. Yeah. Your viewpoint can define a cult or not. Is it a cult or a commune? And is there a difference? Communes will have shared identities and shared behaviors and activities. That doesn't make them a cult, or a cult, not a cult. Is it a cult or is it just alternative thinking? I don't care whether people believe that extraterrestrials want to walk in to my body or not. That's alternative thinking, and we can debate it. I've got a friend who believes the shining ones from Stitchin's books are actually extraterrestrials that have come down and are going to once again enslave humanity. I can talk to him, because he's not running around with a funny wig on, enticing young women to follow him. But you can talk to him, and I can disagree with a lot of what he says. I can see where the story fits for him. Because it's an alternative to my thinking, that doesn't make it a cult. And is it a cult or simply new religious movement, which the FBI called an NRM? These are important questions. If you ever get faced with this stuff, it's something you may have to question. Are you actually watching a friend being poured into a practice, a set of beliefs, into a community that you believe is behaving like a cult? And what do you do? Or is it because that I am so unenlightened that I don't see that what they're doing is actually wonderful and spiritual and marvelous? I think there are good and bad in every group of people, but you give anybody in one group some power and their true colors will shine. It's being able to see those true colors. I think in Wicca we know of something called casting a glamour. A glamour is a magic spell that makes you look attractive. What all cult members can do, or cult leaders can do, sorry, is cast a glamour that is so convincing that they can actually become the bright angel, the embodiment of Jesus Christ, the embodiment of an extraterrestrial. And they can be really convincing. And we have to have our questioning filters up. And that's one of the reasons that a long time ago, I decided to call myself a rational mystic, because I can put my filters on different times, different ways to question my own attitudes and beliefs. So there we go. That's a bit of a chat about cults and cult-like behaviors, and I hope it hasn't scared you too much.